We're in the midst of a huge transformation where our peers, communities, and workplaces are all really melding into one. Welcome to Reimagining Company Culture. My name is Christina Giordano, she, her, and hers, and I'm the Senior Partnerships Manager here at AllVoices. Today, I'm super excited to welcome the next guest onto the interview series, Sacha Connor. She is the founder and CEO of Virtual Work Insider. Sacha, thank you so much for being here. If you want to share a little bit about yourself for our listeners, including your pronouns, and when you were younger, how did you answer the question, what do you want to be when you grow up?
Well, hi, everyone, and thanks for having me, Christina. As you said, I'm Sacha Connor, the founder and CEO of Virtual Work Insider, and my pronouns are she, her, and hers. And when I was younger, I wanted to be, when I grew up, a teacher. So my mom and my dad both started their careers out as teachers, and then they actually both became entrepreneurs in different fields. And while I started out my career as a marketer and a business leader, so first working in account management, agency side for advertising agencies, and then working at the Clorox company for 14 years, leading marketing and sales and new product innovation teams. What's ironic is that now I find myself at that intersection of being both a teacher, not to kids, but instead to executives and leaders and teams on the topics of hybrid and remote work, but also an entrepreneur running my own business.
I love that. We've had a couple folks answer with teacher who are in the field as well, and I think all of us can point to at least one teacher who impacted our lives as well. I want to ask you. You mentioned a little bit about your personal journey to this work. What really defines you?
So it wasn't really until I entered my 40s that I realized how powerful it could be to kind of look back on my life and my career experiences over those years to see where these intersections were that would create kind of a unique value that I could provide to the world, and where that really overlapped with the things that I was becoming more and more passionate about. And so I took kind of this inventory of these intersections a couple of years ago, and these intersections of my experience as a marketer, both client side and agency side, my experience as a business leader and an executive and leading teams, my experiences as an innovator and a content creator, and how that intersected with 11 years of remote work, with how that intersected with me being a wife and a mom that worked from home for many years while also juggling the life of an executive, where that overlapped with me being an employee resource group co-founder and leader. And where that all really came together for me was in the last couple of years, as I thought about what did I want to do long term. And I had this 14-year career at the Clorox company, which is a company that I loved. I loved the culture of the company. I loved the learning and development program there. I loved the different roles I was able to have while there. And it also allowed me this experience to become a remote work and hybrid team leader. So of that 14 years that I was at the Clorox company, 8 of them were leading large hybrid teams for my home office here in Philadelphia. So, my remote work story started back in 2009 when we had our first child. So my daughter Nevin was born in San Francisco, and that's where we were living at the time. And Clorox was headquartered in Oakland, California. So I was, in office at that point.
Right.
But after that first year of Nevin's life, my husband and I were spending so much time going back and forth from West Coast to East Coast that we talked about, what do we want long term? Did we want to be near the people that we loved, which were in the Philadelphia area, or the careers that we loved, which were in the Oakland, California, San Francisco area?
Right.
And at first I thought I was going to have to make a choice. But then I had a bold idea, which was to ask to see if I could keep my job, but do it from 3,000 miles away. And luckily, the chief marketing officer said, okay, you can be an experiment for us. And that's what led to those 8 years of me coming up that learning curve of being a leader in the organization from 3,000 miles and 3 time zones away.
Yeah, truly a first mover in the remote kind of workspace, especially at a large organization, and really before a lot of folks have had that experience as well. And I have a lot of questions around remote work and hybrid work too, but I always like to ask folks as well, what is the kind of current state of the next problem or situation you're trying to solve right now?
Yeah, so I can talk about kind of how that's evolved even with those problems that we're trying to solve. So, after that 8 years of me leading those large hybrid teams while I worked remotely at Clorox in 2018, I did that inventory of those the kind of intersections that we just talked about. And that's when I really realized I had a huge passion for helping teams work across distance. So whether that's office site to office site or an office site to somebody who was working fully remotely. And I finally mustered up the courage to leave Clorox and start my own company. So that's Virtual Work Insider. And the problem we were trying to solve at that moment was really, helping to work across distance, which was defined pre-pandemic, was mostly defined as office to office, right? Whether that was a global team, whether that was a team across the U.S. Then the pandemic hit, and many organizations hopped into becoming a frog or a fully remote organization. And that was a huge transition for many organizations, especially, we work with a lot of large enterprises who are long-standing, 100-year-old companies, 50-year-old companies. So this is huge behavior change. And then right now, as you ask, like, what's the current state, right? Because this is changing on a day-to-day basis. Most companies and organizations are moving towards some sort of definition of hybrid. Every company has a different definition of what that means. But what all these situations have in common is distance, needing to know how to lead, communicate, collaborate, build culture across that distance. And so the problem that we're trying to solve is to help people up that learning curve, to upskill them in those new skills to do that across distance, especially because we know hybrid is harder. So with hybrid, you have the additional factor of distance bias, which will rear its ugly head again. So that is our brain's natural tendency to put more importance on the people and things that are closer to us than those that are further away. And so this is something that's part of the Neuro Leadership Institute's unconscious bias model. So it's really important to help people understand how to create a location inclusive mindset, how to put those processes and skills in place to mitigate that distance bias.
Absolutely. And when we're talking about these large organizations, of course, this is a large scale change too. And we want to talk about creating that culture, really mitigating that bias and making sure that people, when they're joining a team, if they've been there for, 5 to 10 years, they feel like they are included. If we were to really kind of dig in and talk about a hybrid infrastructure checklist, what do you think are the kind of must-haves an enterprise organization needs in place to be successful in a hybrid work environment? Feel free to provide any kind of examples, not naming any names, of course, but what are your thoughts on that working with these companies?
So there are a lot of things to consider as you're moving into whatever hybrid means for you, or if you're staying as a fully remote organization. But one area to really hone in on is around expectation setting. So getting really clear on helping your employees and your people leaders with how to mitigate the communication overload, the meeting fatigue, the burnout. We've all seen those articles and we've all been feeling this. We work across companies, across industries, and this comes up over and over again in terms of communication overload, meeting fatigue, burnout. And one way to think about that is through creating some team working agreements and some areas to get really clear on communication norms. So what are the communication channels that we're going to use to communicate with each other? There's so many technology tools we have at our fingertips, which can be great, but can also be super overwhelming because we're getting pinged and dinged all day long. So setting some norms around when do we use email versus when do we use Microsoft Teams versus Slack, for example. And how fast are we expected to respond? So many times, right? Teams don't have these conversations and they think that they need to respond within 2 hours, within 30 minutes. And it makes people feel very tethered to their devices, which can impact the burnout. And the other piece of expectations is around availability norms. So a lot of times, again, teams have not had these intentional conversations around what are our core meeting hours? When do we actually need to be available for live synchronous meetings with each other? And what is off limits? So for example, in a hybrid environment, commutes have to be integrated back into some people's day to day, and you can't be having a meeting while half the team is commuting. And so it sounds really simple, but a lot of teams haven't yet had those conversations around how do we need to adjust the way we work and actually get to an agreement across the team in those ways of working.
No, absolutely. I think 24/7 availability should not be the goal and is not, realistic. And really having that common language, the common framework too around expectations is so important, especially for, new folks who are joining and, an organization that has a lot of different people as well. In terms of a lot of folks are talking about kind of how you measure engagement in a hybrid environment, and people are coming into the office, they're working remotely. There was one CNBC kind of study or stat that showed that 70% of professionals work remotely at least once a week. In terms of hyper growth organizations, really scaling and hiring folks, what should they be thinking about when they're really trying to authentically engage their employees and measure their happiness, knowing that at the beginning of the pandemic, we saw a lot of Zoom happy hours and, things on Slack that were tried, but we really want to focus on that authenticity.
I think what's important first is to just get to an agreement on what do we mean by employee engagement, right? So, because I hear that those words thrown around a lot,
Yeah.
and how I like to think about it, and how it's usually defined when you have an employee engagement survey, is first, it's statistically tied to employee retention. So, and we know that's super important right now as we're seeing that great resignation and people leaving jobs and changing jobs, statistically tied to higher profitability, higher customer satisfaction. So it's a really important metric. But what it actually means is it's not just if somebody's having fun at work, right? It's not just about happiness or Zoom happy hours, as you said, but it's about that somebody is actually investing themselves at work with their full energy, and they are strongly connected to the work that they do, and they're proud of the work that they do, and they're not just going through the motions. And ADP research actually does some really great engagement studies, and they show overall that global employee engagement is pretty low. But in terms of trying to get that engagement up, some of those important factors are: one is having people work on a team. So people who work on a team are actually more highly engaged than those that are working really individually. But then the real factor is having deep trust in your team leader. And how they define that deep trust is that the team members know what's expected of them, and the team leader can play to one's strengths. So that's why, as we just talked about, that expectation setting piece is so important, because that actually will tie to better employee engagement. If we've had those conversations, created that kind of contract or agreement around those expectations. And then, playing to one's strengths means that you actually know your people, that you've actually found a way to connect with your team members on a more personal side, and not just really transactional, which can happen super easily in a virtual and fully remote environment.
Absolutely. You want to remember that everyone as a team leader, especially, is different. There are different points of their career as well. They have so much going on inside and outside of work too. And trust is really foundational from, an individual level as well. And it's something that it's not a check the box, a set it and forget it. You have to continually build that trust in these relationships. And when you have that trust, you're able to, give people feedback, really actively listen. And I want to ask too around how you see employee feedback management as a really important tool to continually build that culture of listening at organizations.
I think that there should be multiple avenues for feedback at all levels within the organization. So at the company level, at a team level, at a manager and direct report level. And as part of the culture, we need to think about what is the role of feedback. And so again, I always like to talk about what do we mean by culture, because culture is always this kind of ambiguous word.
Yeah.
And oftentimes it gets conflated with Zoom happy hours. Zoom happy hours are not culture. They are camaraderie building type activity, right? And so culture is the values, the attitudes and beliefs and behaviors that are shared by a team. It's how a team works together toward a common goal. It's how people treat each other. And so first you should look at what is the role of feedback within your company culture right now. Are there behaviors where senior leaders are actively role modeling feedback? So not just giving the feedback, but proactively asking for the feedback and taking action on the feedback. And is your company working on developing psychological safety in
Right.
order to enable that feedback? So psychological safety, in case listeners aren't kind of aware of that term. So it's something that Amy Edmondson, who's a Harvard Business School professor, talks a lot about. So she's an expert in this and defines that psychological safety as creating an environment that's conducive to taking interpersonal risks, asking for help, admitting if that mistakes are okay, to be able to admit that. So if anybody wants like additional information on that, just Google Amy Edmondson, and she's got a great book and great resources on that. And what I'll say to you about the importance of thinking about feedback is when you're working in a fully remote or hybrid environment. From my experience as a hybrid leader, as working with teams now across industries, is I've seen a higher likelihood of people avoiding conflict and avoiding bringing up hard feedback in those environments. So it's so much easier to delay or avoid giving that feedback if you're not going to run into that other person in the hallway. So, leaders really need to be proactive in inviting frequent opportunities for listening and for feedback.
Absolutely. And that goes to kind of our earlier point as well, in terms of people coming together and wanting to give feedback in different ways too, depending on how long they've been at the organization, their relationship, the level of trust with the leaders as well. If the leader is inviting and actively listening to that feedback, as you're talking about as well. Sometimes we talk to folks who are, culture champions in every sense of the word in an organization, and they're a little hesitant around collecting one of the channels of kind of anonymous feedback. And I wanted to ask kind of your perspective, especially in a remote or kind of virtual environment. Why is it important to really offer avenues for folks to give anonymous feedback as well?
As we talked about before, I think just having multiple avenues for feedback is really important, and anonymous feedback can be part of that. Especially if that psychological safety that we just talked about hasn't yet been developed. Even as you just mentioned, right? As you think about new hires who have come into the company, newly formed teams, or you're working with a new manager at the beginning of that relationship, that psychological safety might not have been formed yet, where you feel like you can actually speak up and give that live, non-anonymous, feedback. When I went remote back in 2010, I made it a common practice to not only ask for live feedback from my team, but also to use an anonymous survey. So after 2 months of working with any new team while I was remote, I used this survey so that I could make sure that I was getting all the feedback, not just the feedback that people were feeling comfortable giving me live. And so that was even in addition to the formal performance management feedback that we were asked to get like twice a year. And I found that this is an incredibly helpful tool because, again, as we talked about earlier, with me being 3,000 miles away from my team, I wanted to make sure that they weren't holding back because, again, it was so much easier for them to avoid some of those harder conversations and feedback conversations. So giving them another avenue through the survey was really helpful.
Absolutely. Providing a psychologically safe way for folks to give feedback as well, depending on how comfortable they are. When again, it's a process as well. So offering those multiple avenues is important. Specifically, when we're talking to leadership, managers are super important to how you feel at an organization, whether you feel like you could do your best work, if you're supported, and feel included at the company. What are kind of new ways we should be training, especially new managers, or retraining current managers in a remote first or virtual world?
I believe that modern leadership skills are the skills to lead across distance. So whatever distance means for your team or your company. So whether eventually that is office site to office site, whether eventually that is a mix of fully remote or a hybrid team members. And I actually also believe that training needs to not just be at the manager level. This does need to be a two-way street. So managers and individual contributors need and want, based on the research that we've done, they want to learn how to effectively work across distance. So, oftentimes companies will prioritize the training of the managers, but then the individual contributors are asking, me too, I need help with this. And it's not quite fair to put all of the responsibility on the shoulders of the managers. So in the analytic work that we've done with companies, we see the same skill areas coming up over and over again across industries about where people need the help with the upskilling to be able to do this work across distance. And so those areas range from, understanding some of the unconscious biases that pop up in these virtual environments. So I mentioned distance bias earlier as one of them, and needing help with, understanding how to create a location inclusive mindset and the behaviors to mitigate the distance bias. So that's one area. Setting those expectations that we talked about earlier, really giving people the tools to create a team working agreement. What are the types of conversations that they need to have to set those communication norms, availability norms? And then how to work effectively with a hybrid or remote manager or hybrid and remote direct reports, because a lot of us have been taught how to do that. I know that at Clorox, for example, we had a great training and development program on how to be a manager, but it didn't have this lens of how to do it when you're not within eyeshot and earshot of your actual team members. And then, even more complex skills like how do I build a culture of trust and a value-based culture across distance. And what I think is the most important skill, but also the hardest skill to learn, is how to effectively influence across distance. So how do you influence your key stakeholders up, down, inside, outside your organization when you aren't in person with them?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, these are big questions in terms of upskilling, really practicing that effective communication, how you're supporting, influencing, and motivating your teams. When you're thinking about the resources that kind of companies dedicate to, up-leveling their managers and really supporting them, and individual leaders thinking about, am I a good leader? Are my team members feeling inspired? How do you think we should be measuring the effectiveness of leaders, especially middle managers who are kind of that in between, executives and then their team members as well?
I think in any team, whether it's a remote team, a hybrid team, an in-person team, there should be a performance management process in place. And actually, many companies don't have kind of a rigid process yet in place. So it's a really good place to start. And that process should include some KPIs, so key performance indices, which are kind of those more objective goals that are linked to business strategy and business priorities. But also you should be measuring the how. So those skills and those behaviors about how to get work done and how to lead and work with others. And what I'm finding is that most companies actually need to take that step where they look at those competencies and skill areas through the lens, again, of distance, of leading these teams and working on these teams across distance. And so, for example, some metrics could be something like, how is this employee doing with creating a location inclusive environment? So valuing people, giving access to people regardless of their location. And so making sure, again, that's one way to start to mitigate distance bias. Or another example of this is to have an actual objective where, has this team leader actually created a team working agreement and set communication norms and availability expectations and is actively role modeling and reinforcing them. So everything needs to ladder, right? The skills need to ladder to the way that we measure, but that needs to ladder up to the culture that we're actually trying to build within the organization.
Absolutely. What are the kind of non-negotiables or the norms set on the teams? What are the actions that are happening, and how are people feeling on the team as well, working with this leader? I know in terms of leadership, but also in terms of company culture, managing across this distance and really influencing and empowering teams. Business as usual is not cutting it for organizations, and people are really excited, especially in people and talent spaces, about the innovation that is happening. From your perspective, what is the most kind of exciting, innovative people practice or tactic that you've seen companies implement over the past year? And why are you excited by it?
Given all this change that we've been talking about and how companies are in this kind of transition from, whatever geographically distributed organization they were before into that frog or fully remote organization, and then most into hybrid, there needs to be a senior leader that's accountable as the integrator across all locations, as an integrator across all employee experiences, who kind of can help lead that workforce strategy and oversee its execution and its measurement and driving toward that location inclusion that we talked about before. And what I think is interesting in terms of innovation is that several companies have already created or are currently recruiting for a head of remote role. I personally think that the role needs to go broader than that. I think it should be something like a head of hybrid role, or even just a more broad, like head of employee experience role, so that that person is responsible for the entire ecosystem of how people are working together. If you have a head of remote role, but you are a hybrid organization, then your focus, it becomes kind of, again, this like in a two-tiered system. And what's really funny to me, as this role has become more and more mainstream at different companies, is, back in 2018, before I left Clorox, I actually saw the need for this role at Clorox. And I pitched a new position for me. I didn't know what to call it, so I called it like director of corporate collaboration or something. But at the time, I didn't get approval for that new role to be created. It just wasn't the right time yet. But what I love seeing is now is the right time. Like now, most companies are seeing that there really is a need for this. And the first on this cycle of innovation of creating this head of remote role was mostly tech companies or SaaS companies, so GitLab, for example, Prezi, Twitter. But what I see, because again, we work with some tech companies, but a lot of non-tech companies where they actually really need somebody who is that integrator, who is really responsible for this transition and looking across the whole system to help them be successful and sustainable.
Absolutely, because you want this kind of long scale innovation and change to be sustainable across the business. Having an integrator accountability is super important as well. And just that strategic business unit, that leader is really helpful. I know we talked about kind of really defining terms like employee engagement, company culture, how to look at effective leadership as well. Sacha, is there anything that I didn't ask that you'd like to share with our listeners, or perhaps 1 to 2 key insights you hope they bring with them after listening to our conversation here today?
Yeah, another thing just to think about, and this is kind of taking a note from Simon Sinek's thought leadership. So I want you to think about that you are playing in an infinite game. So if you are moving into a hybrid workforce strategy, your eventual office reopening date, if you haven't already, is just one step in an infinite series of steps to evolve for the future of work. So an infinite game requires an infinite mindset. So you really need to approach this as a series of experiments and provide ongoing support for your workforce, because they're going to need to learn and adapt and evolve these mindsets and behaviors like we've been talking about today. And what I'm afraid of and what I've seen is that this can turn into just a check the box exercise of like, when the real estate is reopened, then we're just going to move on and just keep working, right? We're not going to continue to evolve and support the employees, leaders, individual contributors on how to make this sustainable. So, thinking about what is that infinite mindset and how do we continue to help positively impact employee engagement, productivity, and make this sustainable. So if you're also interested in some more tips and resources on hybrid and remote work, I'll be providing some special access to some resources that we have for you, and we'll make the link available in the show notes.
Perfect. That's awesome. I 100% agree with the infinite mindset, also the growth mindset and being proactive about the culture and the environment that you want to create at your workplace as well. Sacha, thank you so much for being on Reimagining Company Culture this afternoon.
Thanks for having me, Christina.
Of course, and as a reminder for folks who are listening at AllVoices, we really believe in that employee feedback management as a requirement for the organization to succeed overall. Have a good rest of your day, everyone.